For centuries, there's been this simple question about the rise of Islam that hides a really fascinating economic puzzle. It's all about the Quraysh, the tribe of the Prophet Muhammad in Mecca, and the business that supposedly made them so powerful. The thing is, the traditional story, well, it has a huge hole in its balance sheet, so let's dig into why. So, how did they pull it off? How does a tribe tucked away in a remote desert valley become a major player in international trade? Well, the obvious answer, the one you'd probably guess, turns out it's almost totally wrong. Okay, so right off the bat, here's the first huge disconnect. We have this romantic image of caravans overflowing with exotic spices, perfumes, silk, the stuff of legends. But the actual historical sources, they tell a very different story. The star exports of Mecca were way more, well, boring. We're talking stuff like leather, animal hides, and even clarified butter. I mean, heavy, bulky, and not exactly rare, right? And get this journey was no weekend road trip. This was a brutal 2-month round trip from Mecca all the way to Syria, across some of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet. And for what? To sell leather and hides to the Syrians who were, surrounded by deserts filled with pastoralists who were already producing leather and hides. It makes absolutely no sense. The historian Patricia Crone, whose work we're digging into here, she just nailed it with this one question. It perfectly captures the absurdity of the situation. Why on earth would you go to all that trouble, all that expense, just to sell a common product in a market that's already flooded with it? It's a brilliant question, and it sets up a fantastic mystery. All right, so let's really tear down why the usual explanations just don't fly. And then we'll get to a theory that, well, it just might solve the whole thing. First off, that whole romantic idea of a spice trade, yeah, historians now pretty much see that as a myth. And second, the idea that this was just simple supply and demand in some kind of ancient free market, that doesn't really work either. You gotta remember, this was not a modern economy. A 2-month caravan trek is a whole different ballgame than overnight shipping. The costs were just insane, so the profits had to be too. Okay, so here's the bottom line. For any of this to make a lick of sense, there had to be a customer up in Syria with a massive, unending, and absolutely critical need for these exact goods. A customer who would pay top dollar for huge amounts of leather. The question is, who on earth was it? Well, the answer, according to this theory, is hiding in plain sight. Because sitting right on the northern frontier of Arabia was one of the biggest, most complex organizations in the entire ancient world, the Roman army. Yep, that Roman army. And look, let's be super clear here. The Roman army didn't just use leather, it devoured it on an industrial scale. We picture them in their iron armor, but really, their entire world was built on leather. One historian called it the plastic of the age, and that's the perfect way to think about it. So let's throw some numbers at this so you can really get the picture. Let's just take one single Roman legion. That's about 5,000 soldiers. A big force for sure. But the really crazy part is what it took to keep them equipped. Okay, prepare yourself because the sheer scale here is just mind-boggling. To provide the tents alone for that one legion of 5,000 soldiers, it's been estimated they needed the hides of almost 66,000 goats. Yeah, you heard that right. Let that number sink in for a second. This wasn't a small-time operation. This was a logistical beast with a ferocious appetite for leather. And we're not just talking about tents. Oh no, it was everything. Shields, scabbards, boots, saddles, straps, waterskins, bags, you name it. Every single soldier was basically a walking consumer of leather goods that were constantly wearing out and needing to be replaced. Now imagine that, times tens of thousands of soldiers stationed in the East. You're looking at a demand that is just off the charts. Okay, so we've got the demand side locked down. The army was hungry for leather. But that's only half the story, right? For this super long distance trade from Mecca to make any economic sense, something bad had to have happened to their local supply in Syria. And if you look at this timeline, you can see exactly how things spiraled out of control. For centuries leading up to the rise of Islam, that border between the Roman and Persian empires was a scene of constant, vicious warfare. And starting in the 3rd century, we're not talking minor border disputes. These were gigantic campaigns that just wrecked the entire countryside. So what you get is this perfect economic storm. All that fighting drove the army's demand for leather through the roof. But at the exact same time, the wars were destroying the local supply chain. Farms were torched, animal flocks were scattered, and the local suppliers were either gone or couldn't produce anymore. The Romans desperately needed leather, and their usual suppliers simply couldn't deliver. Okay, now this theory is incredibly powerful. I mean, it fits perfectly, right? But, and this is a big but, we have to be really honest about the evidence. It's a hugely compelling case, but it's built on circumstantial evidence. We don't have that one piece of paper, that smoking gun purchase order from a Roman general to a Meccan trader.
What we have is a really mixed bag of evidence. On one hand, the trade routes we hear about lead right to Roman army towns like Bostra, and the traditions do talk about dealing with Caesar, which could totally be a catch-all for the Roman authorities. But on the other hand, there's no direct mention of selling stuff to the military. The stories are all about meeting monks, not quartermasters. And weirdly, the caravans seem to just bypass other major Roman forts, which you wouldn't expect if the army was their main customer.
And you know what? Patricia Crown, the historian behind this, was the first to admit it. She said the hypothesis is impossible to prove with the evidence we have. But, and this is key, she also called it highly promising. Why? Because if it's true, it doesn't just solve an old trade puzzle. It completely reframes the world that Islam was born into. So where does that leave us? What's the big takeaway here? Well, we've gone from a business model that makes zero sense, selling leather to a place that has plenty, to a really sophisticated model of being a long-distance supplier to a superpower's massive war machine. And all of this leaves us with one last, truly fascinating question to chew on. It suggests that deep in the background of one of the most important events in human history is something we never really think about, a supply chain. And it makes you wonder if the boring logistics of ancient armies and the traders who kept them going might be one of those huge hidden forces that quietly shapes the entire course of human history.